In the quiet, unassuming corners of our world, darkness sometimes festers, unseen and unheard, until it erupts with a violence that shatters the very fabric of our perceived reality. It's a chilling reminder that the most monstrous acts are not the work of mythical beasts, but of human hands. We often distance ourselves from these stories, believing such horrors only happen in movies or to people far removed from our own lives. But what happens when that evil is closer than you think? What happens when a discovery so gruesome, so meticulously cruel, unfolds that it leaves even the most seasoned investigators speechless and shaken to their core? Today, we delve into a case that did just that. A case that is not for the faint of heart. We are talking about a story of unimaginable cruelty, a puzzle of dismembered bodies, and a hunt for a killer devoid of humanity. This is the story of the 12 bodies in the oil drums. The details you are about to hear are real, painstakingly pieced together from official records, investigator interviews, and journalistic archives. It's a journey into the heart of a truly dark chapter in criminal history. We invite you to join us as we unravel this complex and terrifying case. And if you appreciate in-depth true crime stories that honor the victims and explore the tireless work of those who seek justice, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss what we have in store. Now let us begin. Chapter 1. The Silence of the Barrels. The call came in at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. It was a time of day when the world was still yawning, stretching itself awake under the soft, gray light of dawn. For Detective Miles Corrigan of the Homicide Division, it was the third snooze of his alarm. He was a man who had become accustomed to the rude interruptions of his life, a life dictated by the transgressions of others. The phone buzzed on his nightstand with an insistent, unapologetic rhythm that signaled something more than a routine inquiry. "Corrigan," he grumbled, his voice thick with sleep. The voice on the other end was a rookie patrolman, young and audibly shaken. "Detective? You need to get down to the old Reedridge quarry. Now." There was a tremor in the young officer's voice that cut through Corrigan's grogginess. It wasn't the feigned urgency of a new recruit trying to make an impression. It was the sound of genuine shock. "What have we got?" Corrigan asked, already swinging his legs out of bed, his feet searching for the familiar comfort of his worn leather shoes. "Sir, you have to see it for yourself. I've never seen anything like it." The Reedridge Quarry was a place of forgotten memories. It had been abandoned for decades, a gaping wound in the earth that had slowly filled with stagnant, emerald-green water. The perimeter was a chaotic mess of rusted machinery, crumbling concrete structures, and weeds that grew with a wild, untamed ferocity. It was a place where teenagers dared each other to go for a midnight swim, and where illegal dumping was a common, albeit lesser, crime. It was for the latter reason that the patrol car had been dispatched in the first place. A local resident, an avid bird watcher, had reported seeing a truck near the quarry late the previous night and had called it in as a potential environmental violation. When Corrigan arrived, the scene was already cordoned off with yellow tape, its stark color a violent slash against the muted tones of the quarry. The air was thick with the smell of decay, a sweet, cloying odor that clung to the back of the throat. It was a smell Corrigan knew all too well. It was the smell of death. His partner, Detective Lena Petrova, was already there, her face a pale, grim mask. Petrova was younger than Corrigan, but she possessed a steeliness that belied her years. She had a sharp, analytical mind and a stomach that could handle the goriest of scenes. But as Corrigan approached, he could see a flicker of something in her eyes he had rarely seen before: utter disbelief. "Miles," she said, her voice low, "prepare yourself." She led him towards the edge of the water, to a small, secluded cove hidden by a thicket of overgrown bushes. There, half submerged in the murky water, were 3 55-gallon oil drums. They were old and rusted, their once vibrant paint peeling away to reveal the dull, gray metal beneath. They wouldn't have been remarkable, just more of the junk that littered the quarry, if it weren't for what was seeping from one of them. A dark, viscous fluid, almost black in the morning light, was leaking from a rust-eaten hole near the bottom of one of the barrels. It pooled in the water, creating a grotesque, iridescent sheen on the surface. And floating in that dark pool were things. Corrigan's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. At first, they looked like pale, waterlogged pieces of wood. But as he drew closer, the horrifying reality began to take shape. A finger, a lock of long, dark hair, a piece of what looked like human flesh. "The lid on that one is loose," Petrova said, pointing to the leaking barrel. The patrolman who found it. He thought it was a mannequin at first. He tried to pull the barrel out of the water, and the lid came off. The young officer who had made the call was sitting on the bumper of his patrol car, his head in his hands. He was pale and trembling, his uniform suddenly looking too big for his slight frame. Corrigan made a mental note to have a word with him later, to tell him that what he was feeling was normal, that the day you stop feeling sick at a scene like this is the day you should hang up your badge. The medical examiner, Dr. Alistair Finch, arrived shortly after. Finch was a man who seemed to have been born with a permanent expression of weary resignation. He had seen the worst of humanity, documented its depravities with a clinical, detached precision. But even he paused as he took in the scene. "Good Lord," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the barrels. The process of retrieving the barrels was slow and methodical. The forensics team worked with a quiet, focused intensity, their movements precise and deliberate. They photographed the scene from every conceivable angle, collected samples of the water and the soil, and meticulously documented the position of each barrel. It was a painstaking dance of evidence collection, a slow-motion ballet against a backdrop of unimaginable horror. When they finally managed to hoist the first barrel onto the shore, the lid came off completely, and the contents spilled onto the waiting tarp. A collective gasp went through the assembled officers. Even the most hardened veterans, men and women who had walked through countless bloody crime scenes, were unprepared for this. Inside the barrel was a human body, or rather what was left of one. It had been dismembered, the limbs severed with a brutal, almost savage, force. The pieces had been packed into the barrel with a horrifying efficiency, a jigsaw puzzle of human anatomy. The flesh was pale and bloated from its time in the water, and the process of decomposition had already begun to erase the features that had once made this person unique. It was impossible to tell the age, the gender, the identity of the victim. It was just a collection of parts. But it was the other contents of the barrel that sent a fresh wave of nausea through Corrigan. Mixed in with the body parts was a thick, sludgy substance that looked like a mixture of oil and quicklime. The lime, Corrigan knew, was often used to accelerate decomposition and to mask the smell of decay. It was a trick used by killers who wanted to make their victims disappear. It was a sign of a calculated, cold-blooded effort to erase a human life. As the team began to work on the second barrel, a dreadful sense of anticipation hung in the air. They all knew what they were going to find, but the reality was still a punch to the gut. The second barrel contained another dismembered body, packed in the same horrific manner. And then came the third. Another victim, another life reduced to a gruesome collection of severed limbs. 3 barrels, 3 bodies, and a sinking feeling in Corrigan's stomach that this was only the beginning. The initial examination at the scene provided few answers. The bodies were too decomposed for an immediate identification. There were no personal belongings, no clues left behind that could point to who these people were. The barrels themselves were old and unmarked, their serial numbers rusted away. It was a clean, methodical, and utterly ruthless disposal of human beings. As the sun began to climb higher in the sky, casting long, stark shadows across the quarry, Corrigan stood and stared at the scene before him. The yellow tape, the forensics team in their white suits, the 3 black body bags lying in a row on the ground. It all felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare. He had been a homicide detective for 20 years. He had seen shootings, stabbings, strangulations. He had looked into the eyes of killers and had listened to their justifications, their pathetic excuses for the evil they had wrought. But this was different. This wasn't a crime of passion, a fleeting moment of rage that ended in tragedy. This was systematic. This was organized. The effort it would have taken to dismember 3 bodies, to pack them into heavy oil drums, to transport them to this remote location and dump them in the water. It spoke of a level of planning and a chilling detachment that sent a shiver down Corrigan's spine. He looked over at Petrova, who was talking to one of the forensics technicians. Her face was set in a hard, determined line. She was already in investigation mode, her mind piecing together the few facts they had, trying to find a thread, any thread, that could lead them out of this darkness. "What are you thinking?" she asked, walking over to him. "I'm thinking we need to check every missing persons report filed in the last year," he said, his voice grim. "I'm thinking we need to talk to every informant we have. I'm thinking we need to prepare for the fact that this might not be all of them." His words hung in the air, heavy with a terrible premonition. The discovery at the Reedridge Quarry was not an end. It was a beginning. It was the opening chapter of a story so dark, so twisted, that it would not only shake the foundations of their city, but would also haunt the nightmares of everyone involved for years to come. The silence of the barrels had been broken, and in its place was a scream that would echo in the halls of justice, demanding to be heard. The hunt for a monster had begun. The first 48 hours of the investigation were a frantic, chaotic whirlwind of activity. The homicide division was in overdrive. Every detective on the force pulled in to work on what was now being called the Barrel case. The precinct was abuzz with a nervous energy, a mixture of adrenaline and dread. The story had already been leaked to the press, and the media was in a frenzy. News vans were parked outside the station, their satellite dishes pointed towards the sky like a field of metallic sunflowers. Reporters swarmed around any officer who dared to step outside, shouting questions, their cameras flashing like a barrage of small explosions. Corrigan and Petrova found themselves at the epicenter of this storm. They had been designated as the lead investigators on the case, a testament to their experience and their track record of closing even the most difficult of cases. They set up a command center in a small, windowless conference room, the walls of which were soon covered with whiteboards, maps, and photographs from the crime scene. It was a room that would become their world for the foreseeable future, a space filled with the grim artifacts of their investigation. Dr. Finch and his team at the morgue were working around the clock. The task they faced was monumental. The bodies were so badly decomposed and had been subjected to such brutal dismemberment that the process of reconstruction was a slow and agonizing one. They had to clean and examine every single piece of human remains, trying to match limbs to torsos, to identify any distinguishing marks, any tattoos, any old injuries that could help them to identify the victims. It was a gruesome, heartbreaking puzzle, a task that required not only scientific expertise, but also a profound sense of respect for the dead. The initial reports from the morgue were bleak. The dismemberment had been done with a heavy-bladed tool, possibly an axe or a large cleaver. The cuts were rough, jagged, suggesting a frenzied, almost maniacal, attack. But there was also a chilling degree of precision. The joints had been expertly separated, the work of someone who knew what they were doing. It was a disturbing contradiction, a blend of savage rage and cold, calculated skill. The victims, 2 males and 1 female, had all suffered extensive premortem injuries. They had been tortured. The evidence was clear and undeniable. There were broken bones, deep bruises, and lacerations that were not related to the dismemberment. There were also signs of ligature marks on their wrists and ankles, indicating that they had been bound. Dr. Finch's report was filled with the cold, clinical language of forensic pathology, but the story it told was one of unimaginable suffering and cruelty. The cause of death for all 3 victims was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head. They had been bludgeoned to death before they were dismembered. It was a small mercy, Corrigan thought, that they had not been alive for the final, gruesome act. But it was a very small mercy indeed. While the forensics team worked to give the victims back their names, Corrigan and Petrova focused on the barrels. They had been sent to the lab for analysis, every inch of their rusted surfaces scrutinized for any trace of evidence. The lab technicians managed to recover a partial serial number from one of the barrels, and a search of manufacturing records revealed that it had been part of a batch sold to a local chemical company over a decade ago. The company had since gone out of business, and its records were incomplete. It was a lead, but a faint one, a needle in a vast and ever-growing haystack. The search for missing persons was equally frustrating. They cross-referenced every report filed in the state and neighboring states for the past 2 years, looking for any groups of 3 people who had disappeared together. They waded through hundreds of cases, each one a small tragedy in itself, a story of a family left in limbo, of a life cut short. But none of them seemed to fit the victims from the quarry. The timeline was too uncertain, the identities of the victims still a mystery. Corrigan and Petrova worked tirelessly, fueled by caffeine and a grim determination. They interviewed the bird watcher who had made the initial report, but he had not been able to get a clear look at the truck or its license plate. He could only say that it was a dark-colored, older model, possibly a pickup or a flatbed. It was another small piece of the puzzle, but it was not enough. They canvassed the area around the quarry, knocking on doors, talking to residents, hoping that someone had seen something, anything, that could help. But the quarry was isolated, and the few houses in the vicinity were set far back from the road. No one had heard any unusual noises, no one had seen a strange truck. It was as if the killer had operated under a cloak of invisibility, moving through the world like a ghost. As the days turned into a week, the pressure began to mount. The media was relentless, their headlines screaming about a butcher and a house of horrors. Public fear was growing, and the department was under intense scrutiny. The chief of police was holding daily press conferences, his face a mask of carefully controlled reassurance. But behind the scenes, the frustration was palpable. They were no closer to finding the killer than they had been on the day the barrels were discovered. It was during a late-night brainstorming session in their makeshift command center that Petrova had an idea. "We're thinking about this wrong," she said, her voice tired but clear. "We're focused on the victims, on who they were, but we know nothing about them. What if we focus on the one thing we do know something about?" "The barrels," Corrigan said, catching her train of thought. "Exactly. The barrels, the quicklime, the location. This isn't random. This is a disposal method. A very specific, very risky disposal method. Why go to all the trouble of dismembering the bodies, packing them in barrels, and hauling them out to the quarry? It's a lot of work, a lot of risk. There has to be a reason." She was right. The killer wasn't just trying to hide the bodies. They were trying to obliterate them. The dismemberment, the lime, the water. It was all part of a process of erasure. It was a desperate attempt to make the victims disappear forever. "So, what are you saying?" Corrigan asked. "That the killer is connected to the quarry? That they know the area?" "It's possible," Petrova replied. "Or maybe they're connected to the chemical company that bought the barrels. Maybe they worked there. Maybe they had access to the materials, to the knowledge of how to use them." It was a new angle, a new thread to pull on. They spent the next few days digging into the records of the defunct chemical company, tracking down former employees, anyone who might have had access to those barrels. It was a long shot, but it was better than nothing. It was during this search that they caught their first potential break. A former foreman from the company, a man named Jack Hemlock, had a criminal record. A few minor offenses when he was younger: theft, assault, but nothing that suggested he was capable of this level of violence. However, what caught their attention was the fact that he owned a small, isolated piece of property not far from the Reedridge quarry. Corrigan and Petrova drove out to Hemlock's property the next day. It was a ramshackle house set in the middle of a dense patch of woods, a place where a person could live a quiet, secluded life, a place where screams would go unheard. The house itself was in a state of disrepair, the paint peeling, the porch sagging. A large, rusty pickup truck, similar to the one described by the birdwatcher, was parked in the overgrown yard. As they approached the house, a sense of unease washed over Corrigan. The place was quiet, too quiet. There were no signs of life, no sounds coming from within. He knocked on the door, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered pistol. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Petrova peered through one of the grimy windows. "Miles, you need to see this," she said, her voice tense. Corrigan joined her at the window, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The inside of the house was a chaotic mess. Furniture was overturned, papers were strewn across the floor, and in the center of the room was a large, dark stain on the wooden floorboards. It was the unmistakable color of dried blood. They kicked in the door and entered the house, their guns drawn. The smell of bleach was overwhelming, a desperate, clumsy attempt to clean up a crime scene. They cleared the house room by room, their hearts pounding in their chests. But the house was empty. Jack Hemlock was gone. In the backyard, they found something that confirmed their worst fears. A burn pile still smoldering, and in the ashes, they found fragments of bone, a small metal button from a pair of jeans, and the charred remains of a wallet. But it was what they found in the dilapidated barn at the edge of the property that truly horrified them. Tucked away in a dark corner, hidden under a pile of old tarps, were 9 more oil drums. They were identical to the ones they had pulled from the quarry. And as they opened the first one, the same sickeningly sweet smell of decay filled the air. They had found their killer's workshop, and they had found his other victims. The body count had just risen to 12. The silence of the barrels had given way to a symphony of horror. And as Corrigan and Petrova stood in that dark, foul-smelling barn, they knew that they were no longer just hunting a killer. They were hunting a monster who had turned a quiet corner of their world into his own personal graveyard. And they knew with a chilling certainty that the monster was still out there, that he had been spooked, and that he was now on the run. The race to find Jack Hemlock and to uncover the full, terrifying truth of his crimes had just begun, and they were running out of time. Chapter 2. The ghost and the echoes. The discovery at Jack Hemlock's property transformed the investigation from a complex homicide case into the largest manhunt in the state's history. The barn was not just a storage space for the dead. It was a theater of cruelty. Forensic teams descended upon the isolated property, and what they unearthed painted a picture of prolonged and sadistic horror. The barn floor was stained with blood from numerous victims, and the air was thick with the chemical tang of lime and cleaning agents, a futile attempt to erase the evidence of unspeakable acts. Scattered amongst the tools and farming equipment were chilling artifacts of Hemlock's crimes. Restraints, an assortment of crude, heavy-bladed weapons, and personal effects belonging to the victim's faded photograph, a single earring, a child's worn teddy bear. Each item was a silent testament to a life brutally extinguished. The 12 barrels, 3 from the quarry and 9 from the barn, held the remains of 12 individuals. The sheer scale of the atrocity was staggering. It wasn't the work of a man who had snapped. It was the work of a predator who had been hunting for a very long time. Now, the primary objective was twofold: identify the 12 victims and capture the man who had become a ghost, Jack Hemlock. His face was plastered on every news channel, his name on the lips of every citizen. A bolo, be on the lookout, was issued nationwide. His old pickup truck was found abandoned at a bus station 2 towns over, a clear indication that he had fled and was likely using public transportation to put distance between himself and the investigation. The psychological toll on the investigative team was immense. The gruesome task of processing the remains from the barn fell to Dr. Finch's team. The sight of so much carnage, the sheer volume of dismembered bodies, was enough to test the mettle of the most seasoned professionals. Detectives worked in shifts, poring over evidence, chasing down leads that often led to dead ends. The command center was a hive of frantic energy, but beneath it lay a current of exhaustion and despair. Corrigan found himself staring at the white boards late at night, the faces of missing persons blurring into a single, haunting image of lost hope. He saw the victims in his dreams, their silent screams echoing in the darkness. Petrova, ever the pragmatist, channeled her energy into the painstaking process of identification. With 12 Jane and John Does, the task was monumental. They released details of the victims' descriptions to the public, approximations of age, height, hair color, and any distinguishing features that had survived the killer's attempts at erasure. A tattoo of a butterfly on a female victim's ankle, a surgical pin in a man's knee, a distinctive dental filling. These small details were their only hope of giving the victims their names back, of offering some semblance of closure to the families who were undoubtedly searching for them. The first breakthrough came a week after the discovery at the barn. A woman from a neighboring state called the hotline, her voice trembling. She had seen the news report about the butterfly tattoo. Her younger sister, a free-spirited girl who had left home to travel the country, had a similar tattoo. She hadn't heard from her in over 6 months, but had held out hope that she was simply off the grid, living her life. Dental records confirmed the worst. The first of the 12 victims had a name. This single identification opened the floodgates. As more names were attached to the victims, a pattern began to emerge. They were all transients, drifters, people living on the fringes of society. They were runaways, hitchhikers, individuals who had fallen through the cracks. They were people whose absence might not be immediately noticed, people who were vulnerable and easily preyed upon. Hemlock had not chosen his victims at random. He had carefully selected those he believed the world would not miss. Each identification was a small victory, but it came with a heavy price. Corrigan and Petrova had the heart-wrenching duty of notifying the families. They sat in living rooms filled with faded photographs and cherished memories, and listened to stories of the people the victims had been before they had crossed paths with a monster. They saw the devastating impact of Hemlock's cruelty, the ripple effect of his violence that spread far beyond the barn and the quarry. While the identities of the victims were slowly being uncovered, the hunt for Hemlock was growing cold. He had vanished without a trace. They dug into his past, trying to understand the man behind the monster. He was a loner, a man who had kept to himself. He had no close friends, no family to speak of. His co-workers at the chemical plant remembered him as a quiet, unremarkable man who did his job and went home. There was nothing in his past that hinted at the darkness that lurked within him. It was Petrova who stumbled upon the key. While sifting through a box of old employee records from the chemical company, she found a series of disciplinary reports filed against Hemlock. He had been reprimanded several times for insubordination and for making unsettling comments to his female co-workers. But it was a small, handwritten note at the bottom of one of the reports that caught her eye. It was a complaint from a co-worker, stating that Hemlock had been seen talking to a young woman, a temp worker, who had disappeared shortly after. The matter had been dismissed at the time, but now it was a glaring red flag. They tracked down the temp agency and found the woman's records. Her name was Sarah. She had vanished a decade ago, around the same time that Hemlock had left his job at the chemical company. Her case had gone cold, another missing person lost in the shuffle. A DNA sample from her mother was a match to one of the unidentified victims from the barn. This was the turning point. Sarah was not a transient. She was a local girl, a college student working a summer job. Her disappearance had been reported, investigated. Hemlock had not started with drifters. He had started with someone he knew, someone from his own community. He had made a mistake, and it was this mistake that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The investigation now had a new focus: Sarah. They re-examined her case file, re-interviewed her friends and family. They learned that she had been uncomfortable around Hemlock, that he had made advances towards her that she had rejected. She had told her friends that he gave her the creeps. They also learned something else. Sarah had a cousin, a truck driver who had been fiercely protective of her. After she had disappeared, he had made his own inquiries, had even confronted Hemlock, but with no evidence, the police could do nothing. The cousin had since moved out of state, but Corrigan and Petrova knew they had to find him. Took them 2 days to track him down. He was a long-haul trucker, living a solitary life on the road. When they told him what they had found, he was silent for a long time. And then he told them a story of a dark road, a chance encounter, and a chilling confession. He had seen Hemlock at a truck stop in another state just a few weeks ago. Hemlock, thinking he was safe, had let his guard down. He had been drinking and he had started to talk. He had bragged about what he had done, about how he had outsmarted the police for years. The cousin had not known what to believe. He had thought Hemlock was just a drunk, spinning a tale of drunken fantasy. But now he knew it was true, and he knew where Hemlock was headed. He had been talking about finding work on an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico, a place where a man could disappear, where the past could be washed away by the sea. Suddenly, the ghost had a destination. The manhunt, which had stretched across the country, now had a focal point. Corrigan and Petrova, along with a team of federal agents, were on a plane to the Gulf Coast within hours. The echoes of the past had finally given them a path to the future, a path that they hoped would lead them to the monster they had been hunting for so long. The net was closing in on Jack Hemlock, and for the first time since the discovery of the first barrel, there was a glimmer of hope that justice was within reach. Chapter 3. The Devil in the Details. The flight to the Gulf Coast was tense. For Corrigan and Petrova, the end of the manhunt felt tantalizingly close, yet they knew that a cornered animal is the most dangerous. Jack Hemlock had been a ghost for weeks, a phantom who had slipped through their fingers time and again. Now, thanks to the trucker's tip, they had a solid lead, but the vast and transient world of offshore oil rigs presented a new set of challenges. It was a world of rough men, hard labor, and a culture of not asking too many questions. A perfect place for a man like Hemlock to disappear. Working with the U.S. Marshals and local law enforcement, they began the arduous task of checking every rig, every supply boat, every transient hotel in the coastal towns. They distributed Hemlock's photo, now weathered and grim, to every foreman and hiring manager. The response was a slow, frustrating trickle of information. A few people thought they might have seen him, a man matching his description asking for work, but nothing concrete. The ghost was still elusive. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A clerk at a small-town pawn shop, 100 miles inland from the coast, recognized Hemlock's face from the news. He had come in a few days prior, desperate to sell a collection of old tools. The clerk had been suspicious of the man's nervous energy and the haste with which he took a lowball offer. What sealed the investigators' interest was the clerk's description of the tools. They were heavy, industrial grade, and included a set of large, custom-made cleavers. The kind of tools that could be used for dismemberment. Security footage from the pawn shop confirmed it was Hemlock. He was thinner, his face gaunt and etched with paranoia, but it was him. More importantly, the footage showed him getting into a beat-up sedan with out-of-state plates. They had a vehicle. They had a direction. The ghost was no longer a phantom. He had a physical presence, a trail they could follow. The car was traced to a recent cash sale, a dead end. But the pawn shop sighting gave them a new geographical focus. Hemlock wasn't on the coast. He was moving inland. Petrova, piecing together the timeline, theorized that he had been spooked by the increased law enforcement presence in the port towns. He was running again, but this time he was making mistakes. He was getting desperate. The final chase was a methodical, digital, and on-the-ground pursuit. They tracked his movements through a series of small, desperate crimes. A gas station drive-off, a stolen credit card used at a dingy motel. Each transaction, each sighting was a pin on the map, drawing a jagged line across the southern states. He was heading west, towards the vast, empty expanses of the desert. The end came not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of a police scanner. A highway patrolman in a remote stretch of Arizona pulled over a sedan for a broken taillight. A routine stop, but when the officer ran the plates, they came back as stolen. And when he ran the driver's license, the name was an alias, but the photo was a match to the bolo that had been on every cop's radar for weeks. The officer, with a calm that belied the adrenaline coursing through his veins, called for backup. When Corrigan and Petrova arrived, Hemlock was already in custody, sitting in the back of a patrol car, his face a mask of sullen defeat. The monster who had haunted their waking moments and their darkest dreams was now just a man in handcuffs, his reign of terror over. The interrogation was a study in chilling normalcy. Hemlock was not a ranting madman or a criminal mastermind. He was a quiet, articulate man who spoke of his horrific crimes with a chilling, detached calm. He confessed to everything, his voice a monotone drone as he recounted the details of each murder. He told them how he had chosen his victims, how he had lured them back to his property with promises of work or a place to stay. He described the torture, the dismemberment, the disposal of the bodies, all with the same flat effect, as if he were describing a mundane day at the office. His motive, as he explained it, was a twisted cocktail of resentment and a god complex. He hated the world, hated the people who he felt had wronged him. He saw his victims as disposables, people who would not be missed, people he could exert his power over. In his dark, twisted mind, he was not a murderer. He was a cleaner, ridding the world of what he considered to be human refuse. The torture was a part of this perverse ritual, a way for him to feel the control and the power that had been denied to him his entire life. He showed no remorse, no empathy. The only emotion he displayed was a flicker of pride as he described how he had eluded capture for so long. He was a man utterly devoid of humanity, a black hole of narcissism and rage. The trial was a media circus, but the outcome was never in doubt. With his detailed confession and the mountain of physical evidence against him, the jury took less than an hour to find him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 12 consecutive life sentences, with no possibility of parole. He would die in prison, a forgotten man, his name a byword for pure, unadulterated evil. For Corrigan and Petrova, the verdict was not a celebration, but a somber conclusion to the darkest chapter of their careers. They had caught the monster, but the scars of the case would remain. They had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back at them. The faces of the 12 victims, the silent screams from the barrels, the chilling, detached voice of Hemlock in the interrogation room. These were things they would carry with them forever. In the aftermath, they both took a long, much-needed leave of absence. Corrigan spent his time trying to reconnect with a world that had seemed so distant during the investigation. Petrova traveled, trying to wash away the grime of the case in foreign lands and unfamiliar cultures. But they both knew that they had been changed, that a part of them would forever be in that dark barn, surrounded by the silence of the barrels. The case of the 12 bodies in the oil drums became a cautionary tale, a horrifying reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of a quiet, unassuming life. It was a story of a monster who had walked among them, a ghost who had left a trail of unimaginable pain and suffering. But it was also a story of the tireless dedication of those who had hunted him, who had given the victims their names back, and who had ensured that their silent screams were finally heard. It was a testament to the enduring power of justice, and a promise that even in the face of the most profound darkness, there are still those who will fight for the light.